Philadelphia, 1998. A 24-year-old nursing student with an unwavering moral compass disappeared after witnessing her building superintendent threaten a maintenance worker. The authorities, believing she had fled involvement in something sinister, labeled her a person of interest. For 9 years, her mother fought to prove her daughter's innocence, never knowing Esther was imprisoned behind a bricked-up storage room just 3 blocks from their apartment. Then, a gas leak in the superintendent's building led to a discovery that would expose a predator and vindicate a witness who had refused to stay silent. Before we begin this journey together, I'd love to know, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? It means everything to know you're here, bearing witness to Esther's story with me.
The Philadelphia of 1998 was a city of stark contrasts, where gleaming downtown towers cast long shadows over neighborhoods that time and prosperity had forgotten. For Esther Penn, a 24-year-old woman whose compassion ran as deep as her sense of justice, it was home. She possessed an inner fire that had drawn her to Temple University's nursing program, not for prestige or money, but because she believed healing was a form of resistance against suffering. She didn't just want a career, she wanted a calling, a way to fight back against the casual cruelty she saw inflicted on the vulnerable. Esther was known for speaking up. Her voice could cut through indifference like a scalpel through tissue. Whether confronting a dismissive professor about outdated pain management protocols or challenging the building superintendent, Rice Hugan, about his treatment of elderly tenants, she never backed down. She worked 15 hours a week at a corner pharmacy, its windows perpetually fogged with condensation, to help her mother, Fanny Penn, make ends meet. The job was more than income. It was her observation post, where she witnessed her neighbors' daily struggles, the quiet injustices that never made headlines. One humid evening in late August, Esther was restocking shelves when she saw it through the streaked window. Under the flickering amber glow of a street lamp, a scene of brutal intimidation unfolded. Rice Hugan, their building superintendent, had cornered one of the maintenance workers, a quiet man named Joseph Till, against a dumpster in the alley. Rice was a man in his early 50s with heavy features and a reputation for preying on those who couldn't fight back. Esther couldn't hear the words, but the language of violence was universal. Rice had Joseph backed against the rusted metal, his thick finger jabbing into the smaller man's sternum with such force that Joseph's head snapped back with each thrust. Joseph, who was always scrambling to keep his job despite constant harassment, looked terrified. His hands were raised in surrender, his mouth forming words that looked like pleas. Esther watched, her own hands clenching the bottle of aspirin she'd been shelving as Rice's controlled menace escalated. He grabbed Joseph by the throat, lifting him slightly off his feet, his face a mask of cold, calculated rage. The confrontation ended abruptly. Rice released Joseph with a violent shove that sent the maintenance worker sprawling into the garbage bags. Then Rice walked away, his stride unhurried, confident, the walk of a man who knew he was untouchable. Esther's heart hammered against her ribs. This was more than workplace bullying. This was predatory violence, the kind that thrived in forgotten corners where no one was watching. Except someone had been watching. She had been watching. 3 days later, Joseph Till's small basement apartment was empty. His few possessions, a coffee maker, some clothes, a photograph of his mother, were gone. Neighbors whispered that Rice had finally fired him, that Joseph had packed up and left town in shame. But Esther, with her nursing student's attention to detail and her innate sense of when something was desperately wrong, felt a chilling certainty. Joseph hadn't left. He had vanished. And the last person to see him was Rice Hugan. Her decision to remember that moment, to file it away in her sharp, analytical mind, would cost her the next 9 years of her life. In the days following the alley confrontation, a suffocating unease settled over Esther like a fog that wouldn't lift. The silence from Joseph's apartment wasn't peaceful. It was the dead, empty void of erasure. Joseph was gone, and nobody seemed to care. It was as if he had simply been deleted from the world, another casualty in a city that had perfected the art of forgetting its most vulnerable. Esther, however, could not forget. The image of Rice Hugan's face, twisted in that mask of barely contained violence, played on endless loop in her mind. She was a witness to something terrible. She just didn't know how terrible yet. Her mistake was underestimating a predator's instinct. Rice Hugan was a man who had survived decades in the shadows by noticing everything, and he had noticed her. He had seen the way she stood frozen at the pharmacy window, her expression not one of fear, but of judgment. He recognized her for what she was, a problem, a loose end, a witness who might speak. He approached her a week later as she walked home from her clinical rotation at the hospital. The Rice Hugan who stopped her on the corner of Broad and Somerset was a different man from the one she'd seen in the alley. His face was arranged in an expression of neighborly concern, his voice a low, gravelly rumble of false warmth. "Miss Penn, Esther, right?" he began, blocking her path with his considerable bulk. "Got a minute? I wanted to talk to you about what you saw the other night, that thing with Joseph." Esther's guard went up instantly. Every instinct screamed danger. "There's nothing to discuss, Mr. Hugan," she said, her voice cold, her body angling away from him. No, please," he insisted, his tone wounded, almost fatherly. "That guy, Joseph, he was stealing from the building. Tools, copper pipes, you name it. I was trying to scare him straight, for his own good. He took off before I could help him, and now I'm worried. I thought maybe you'd heard from him, being the caring type and all." It was a masterful performance. He was positioning himself as the concerned employer, the misunderstood good guy. But Esther's instincts, honed by years of reading patients' unspoken pain, were screaming that this was a lie wrapped in charm. "I haven't seen him," she said flatly, "and I need to get home." Of course," he said smoothly. "Look, I know how it must have looked, and I feel terrible. I'm actually heading over to one of my properties right now to check on a furnace issue. It's on your way home. Walk with me for a block. Let me explain my side so there's no bad blood. I'd hate for a good tenant like your mother to feel uncomfortable in my building." The lure was a masterpiece of manipulation. He wasn't asking her to get in a vehicle. He was inviting her on a short, public walk. He was appealing to her sense of fairness, her willingness to hear both sides. And he was doing it all while subtly threatening her mother's housing security. Esther's mind raced. Part of her, the student, the future nurse trained to gather information, was curious. She wanted to hear his explanation to assess whether her instincts were right. Her confrontational nature warred with her survival instinct. In the end, her confidence in her own strength made the decision. She would walk with him for 1 block, hear him out in public, and then go home. It was a fatal miscalculation. She walked with him the few blocks to another property, a narrow row house with boarded windows that looked like every other decaying building on the blighted street. "Just need to check the pilot light in the basement," he said, unlocking the heavy door. "Come in for just a second, out of this heat." The moment she crossed the threshold, everything changed. The concerned neighbor vanished. The door slammed shut behind her with a finality that stopped her heart. The deadbolt slid home with a sound like a coffin closing. Rice Hugan turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw the same predatory emptiness she'd seen in the alley. She hadn't walked into a building, she had walked into a trap. The first thing Fanny Penn felt was wrong. It was a wrongness that had no name, a discordant note in the familiar melody of her morning. When she returned from her night shift cleaning offices downtown around 6:30 in the morning, the apartment was usually alive with Esther's preparations. The sound of the shower running, the radio playing softly, the clatter of breakfast dishes. This morning, there was only silence. A silence so complete it seemed to have weight and texture. "Esther, baby, you up?" she called, her voice still hoarse from the industrial cleaning chemicals. The silence that answered was suffocating, oppressive. A cold knot of dread began forming in Fanny's chest. She walked down the narrow hallway to her daughter's room. The door stood open. The bed was made with military precision, completely unlike Esther's usual hurried, rumpled style. Her daughter had not slept in that bed. Fanny's mind raced through explanations, each one more desperate than the last. Esther stayed at the hospital library to study. She spent the night at a classmate's apartment. She met someone. But with each rationalization, a louder, more primal voice screamed that something was catastrophically wrong. Esther was not a girl who stayed out without calling. She was not a girl who kept secrets from her mother. Fanny moved through the apartment with frantic energy. Esther's nursing uniform hung in the closet. Her textbooks sat stacked on the desk, a page marked with a coffee-stained bookmark. Her purse was on the kitchen counter, wallet and keys still inside. Everything Esther needed for her life was here. Everything except Esther herself. The fear was no longer just fear. It was a physical force crushing Fanny's chest, making it impossible to breathe. This wasn't a change of plans. This was an absence, a void, a terrible wrongness in the fabric of the universe. She grabbed the phone with shaking hands and called Esther's study partner, then her supervisor at the pharmacy, then the hospital. No one had seen her since she'd left her clinical rotation the previous afternoon at 5 o'clock. The last thread of hope snapped. Her daughter had been coming home, and she had never arrived. Fanny's call to the Philadelphia Police Department was a mother's desperate plea. She'd explained everything: her daughter's reliability, her perfect attendance record, the absolute certainty that Esther had not left willingly. And then she told them about Rice Hugan. "My daughter saw something," Fanny said, her voice dropping to an intense whisper. "She saw our building super, Rice Hugan, attacking one of his workers. That man, Joseph, he disappeared right after. My Esther told me she was scared of Rice. Please, you have to talk to him. Please." She was giving them a name. She was giving them a suspect. She was giving them the truth. She was a mother, and her instincts were screaming that the monster who had taken her daughter was not a stranger, but a man they saw every day. A man who held power over their housing, their safety, their lives. It was a mother's instinct, born of fierce protective love, and it was the absolute, unvarnished truth. A truth the system was not ready to hear. The Esther Penn file landed on Detective Wood Jacobs' desk with an unremarkable thud, one case among dozens that arrived each week. Jacobs, a 15-year veteran with tired eyes and a permanent expression of seen-it-all cynicism, scanned the initial report with practiced efficiency. In his mind, a familiar narrative began to take shape, one heat scene play out 100 times before. Victim, 24-year-old female, outspoken nursing student. Location: low-income neighborhood with high crime rates. Disappeared after witnessing her building superintendent, Rice Hugan, assault a maintenance worker named Joseph Till, who had also vanished. Both men had criminal histories, Rice for assault and theft, Joseph for minor drug possession. Jacob sighed, a long exhalation of weary resignation. He knew this story. Young woman with a big mouth gets mixed up in something shady with small-time criminals. Maybe they were trying to shake down the superintendent. Maybe a deal went bad. The other guy disappears. Now she's in the wind, either scared or guilty. The mother, in her grief, points at the easy target. It made a certain kind of street-level sense. It was simpler, more statistically probable than an abduction. He did his due diligence. Ran Rice Hugan's name, priors for assault, possession of stolen property, known slumlord. Ran Joseph Till's name, drug offenses, unemployed. The pieces fit his narrative perfectly. Then he looked at Esther Penn. Clean record, but a nursing student who worked in a pharmacy. Access to drugs. Maybe she thought she was smarter than she was, got in over her head. When Detective Jacobs called Fanny Penn, his voice was a tired, professional monotone. He listened as the mother poured out her story, her fear, her absolute conviction that Rice was involved. "Mrs. Penn, I understand your concern," he said when she'd finished, the words a well-worn script. "We've looked into Mr. Hugan and Mr. Till. Frankly, it appears your daughter may have gotten involved with some questionable individuals. It's not uncommon in these situations for someone to decide to lay low for a while. We're treating this as a voluntary disappearance." The explosion from Fanny was immediate. "Involved? My baby is a nursing student. She works to help me pay rent. She saw a crime and she was scared. She's a victim, not a criminal." "At this time, there's no evidence of foul play," Jacob said, his voice hardening with bureaucratic finality. "Given her connection to another missing person, we're flagging her as a person of interest. We've put out a bulletin. If she surfaces, we'll need to speak with her." He hung up the phone, Fanny's anguished protest still ringing in his ears, a sound he'd learned to tune out long ago. He had made his decision based on probability, on limited resources, on the grim calculus of triage. He had not just dismissed a mother's plea. He had, in the cold language of law enforcement, effectively branded a missing victim as a potential fugitive. And in doing so, he had condemned her to a silence that would last 9 years. The world Esther Penn woke to was a 6 by 8 foot rectangle of absolute, suffocating darkness. The air was stale, thick with the smell of damp brick and something metallic, the scent of old pipes and decay. Her first conscious thought was confusion, profound and disorienting. Where was she? The last thing she remembered was the slam of a door, the click of a lock, and then nothing. Panic came seconds later, cold and electric. She scrambled upright, her hands flying out, searching for familiar landmarks, but there were none. Her fingers met only rough brick and crumbling mortar. She was in a box, a room the size of a closet with no windows, no furniture, no light. A scream built in her throat, raw and animalistic, but it died before reaching her lips. The walls seemed to swallow sound itself. She was a nursing student. She had studied trauma, captivity, the psychology of victims. But academic knowledge was a universe away from the brutal reality of being that victim. Her world had been systematically stripped of all sensory input. No light to see by, no sounds to orient herself, nothing to touch but cold, rough surfaces. Her sense of time immediately began to dissolve. Was it day or night? Had she been here hours or days? Her captor, Rice Hugan, became the only feature of her existence.
Once each day, or what she thought was once a day, she would hear heavy bolts sliding back. A small section of brick wall would swing open on hidden hinges, and a tray would be pushed through. A piece of bread, a cup of water, sometimes a small portion of canned food. Rice rarely showed his face. He rarely spoke. His presence was just a brief, terrifying intrusion. This sensory deprivation was deliberate psychological warfare designed to break her, to erase her sense of self, to reduce her from a person to a compliant, dependent thing. Without external anchors, her mind began to turn on itself. She had vivid hallucinations in the darkness, phantom voices, shifting patterns of light that didn't exist. The outspoken nursing student who had walked into that house was being systematically dismantled. But Esther Penn was a fighter. As the initial shock receded, replaced by the monotonous reality of captivity, a different part of her emerged. It was the quiet, disciplined, resilient core of her being. She understood that if she surrendered to despair, she would die in this place. Her survival would not be a matter of physical strength, but mental fortitude. She began to fight back with the weapons of intellect and memory. The prison was designed to make her forget, to erase her. Esther made a solemn vow in the darkness. She would not be erased. She would remember everything. She would survive. And someday, somehow, she would bear witness to what had been done to her.
For Fanny Penn, the years after Esther's disappearance were a slow descent into a purgatory of grief and determination. The initial media attention, the candlelight vigils, the community prayers, they all faded like morning mist. Philadelphia, a city with an endless appetite for tragedy, moved on. But Fanny could not. She was frozen in time, trapped in that August evening of 1998. Her life became a dual existence. On the surface, she was defined by quiet, stoic grief. She continued her night shifts, cleaning offices and buildings where people with normal lives worked. She paid her bills, maintained the apartment, functioned. But beneath the surface, she was a warrior engaged in an all-consuming battle against forgetting and against the lie. She refused to let Esther become a cold case, a forgotten file branded with suspicion. She became a reluctant activist, armed with a stapler and stacks of homemade flyers. But her flyers were different. They didn't just say missing, they said missing and innocent. She spent her days off walking the streets, taping Esther's bright, confident face to telephone poles, bus shelters, community center bulletin boards. It was her quiet protest against the official narrative that had so carelessly slandered her daughter. Fanny became a familiar figure in the neighborhood, the mother of that girl who disappeared. She could feel the shift in her neighbors' attitudes, the way sympathy had curdled into weary judgment. They saw a woman who couldn't let go. We couldn't accept the painful truth that her daughter was mixed up in something bad. Her most frustrating battle was with the Philadelphia Police Department. She called Detective Jacobs's office once a month, her voice a familiar refrain. "Any news, detective? Any new leads? Have you at least cleared my daughter's name?" The answer was always the same, a tired sigh, a bureaucratic brush-off. "Nothing new to report, Mrs. Penn. The file is still open. We'll call if anything changes." She knew they saw her as a nuisance, a grieving mother clinging to denial. But she could not stop. To stop would be to betray Esther, to accept their lie, to let the world believe her daughter was a criminal. That was a dishonor she would not, could not allow. Every year on Esther's birthday, she held a small vigil on the steps of their church. The first year, dozens came. By the 9th year, in 2007, the crowd had dwindled to a handful of faithful friends. They would light candles, say prayers, release white balloons into the sky, fragile symbols of hope that refused to die. Fanny kept Esther's room exactly as she'd left it, a perfect, heartbreaking time capsule. The nursing textbook still sat on the desk, a page marked where her daughter had stopped reading. It was a room full of ghosts and promises, her private sanctuary where she could still feel close to the daughter she'd lost. It was the place that fueled her unending fight, a quiet, desperate battle to prove to a world that had forgotten that her daughter was not a fugitive. She was a victim, and she was still out there somewhere, waiting to be found. By early 2007, Rice Hugan had settled into a comfortable rhythm with his monstrous secret. 9 years had passed, and the initial anxiety of his crime had been replaced by lazy arrogance. He had committed what he believed was the perfect crime, and the world had proven him right by forgetting Esther Penn ever existed. His control over her was, in his mind, absolute. She was no longer a person. She was part of the building's architecture, no more alive than the rats in the walls. This complacency was reflected in his property's condition. The same neglect he showed his tenants, he showed his own building. The plumbing leaked, the roof sagged, and the ancient wiring that snaked through the walls was a frayed fire hazard waiting for a spark. He had grown so comfortable in his dark world that he'd become blind to the physical dangers festering within it. The spark came on a freezing February night. It was born in a section of cloth-wrapped wire in the basement, wire that had been installed when the building was constructed in the 1920s. For years, it had been slowly decaying, its insulation crumbling. The bare copper finally touched a gas pipe. The spark was small at first, barely visible in the darkness, but it ignited decades of accumulated dust and debris. The fire grew, and with it came smoke, thick, acrid, greasy smoke that filled the basement. In her bricked-up cell, Esther's first sensation was a change in the air. A sharp, chemical smell cut through the familiar mustiness. Then came sound, a low, hungry crackling that wasn't part of the building's usual symphony. Smoke began seeping through cracks in her wall, first a thin gray tendril, then a choking wave. The air grew hot. Darkness took on a terrifying orange glow visible through the gaps in the brickwork. Panic seized her, raw and absolute. She was trapped in a sealed box in the heart of a burning building. Her carefully maintained discipline shattered. She began to scream, her voice raw and smoke-choked, a sound of pure terror. She beat her fists against the walls, the sound lost in the fire's roar. A neighbor smelled smoke and called 911. The call went to Ladder Company 9, commanded by Captain Dennis Cole, a 25-year veteran. For Captain Cole and his crew, it was another call, another building fire in another forgotten neighborhood. They had no way of knowing they were about to answer a prayer 9 years in the making. They arrived to find thick smoke pouring from the basement. Captain Cole assessed quickly. This was a deep-seated fire consuming the old structure's bones. "Defensive attack," he barked. "Vent it before anyone goes in." His crew pulled hoses, connected to hydrants, prepared to fight. But ventilation was critical. They needed to release the superheated gases building inside. 2 firefighters moved to the basement exterior, searching for access points. The windows were too small, barred. They found a section of foundation wall and began swinging axes. Thwack, 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 the rhythmic demolition of brick and mortar. They broke through the outer wall, but instead of the burning basement, they hit another surface, a brick partition. "What the hell?" one firefighter grunted. "Captain, there's a false wall here." Captain Cole, who'd seen hidden rooms used for drug operations and stolen goods, made a quick decision. "Go through it. Let's see what's inside." The firefighters turned their axes on the inner wall. The old mortar shattered easily. They tore a jagged hole and smoke poured out. One firefighter shined his flashlight through the opening. The beam landed on something that stopped his heart. A pale, emaciated figure huddled in the corner, eyes wide with terror so profound it seemed to burn through the smoke. For a moment frozen in time, the firefighters could only stare. They had been fighting a fire. They had just broken down the door of a tomb. "Get her out!" Captain Cole roared, his voice breaking through the shock. "Now! Go, go, go!" Two firefighters scrambled through the hole. The heat was intense, the smoke suffocating. They reached Esther, their gloved hands surprisingly gentle as they lifted her impossibly light body. She was alive. She was breathing. They carried her out into the cool night air, a spectral rescue unfolding in the chaos of flashing lights. Paramedics rushed forward with oxygen. As they lay Esther on the gurney, her eyes, which had been wide with blank terror, began to focus. She was looking at faces, at the star-filled sky above. The world that had been a 6-by-8-foot box for 9 years had suddenly, violently, miraculously exploded into light, sound, and sensation. The news crackled over police radio, a call so bizarre the dispatcher thought it was a mistake. The call was routed to the detective on duty that night. By cosmic coincidence, it was Wood Jacobs. When he heard the address and the name Rice Hugan, a cold dread settled over him. The Esther Penn case. The mother who wouldn't give up. A reckoning 9 years overdue. Esther was rushed to Temple University Hospital. The reunion was sacred, almost unbearable in its power. When Fanny Penn was led to the emergency room, she saw her daughter, a fragile, bird-like creature in white sheets and beeping machines. But she knew her. She saw the familiar, fierce spirit in those eyes. Fanny collapsed at the bedside, her hand covering her mouth, sobs shaking her body. Esther reached out a thin, trembling hand and touched her mother's face. Her voice, when she spoke, was dry and raspy, the first words to another human besides her captor in 9 years. They were not words of relief or love or pain. They were a witness's words. "I saw everything, Mama," she whispered, her gaze locking onto Fanny's with profound, chilling clarity. "I saw what he did to Joseph, and I'm going to make sure everyone else does too." The silent chamber had been breached. The voice that had been buried for 9 years was finally, powerfully, devastatingly free. Rice Hugan was arrested that night, found watching the fire scene from the shadows. When investigators searched the hidden room, they found Esther's testament scratched into the brick. Her name, her mother's name, dates marking 9 stolen years, and the name Joseph Till with the word murdered beside it. Esther's testimony led police to excavate the basement floor. There they found Joseph Till's remains, along with those of another missing tenant. Esther Penn had not just survived, she had solved murders the city had forgotten. Her voice, once silenced, had become the instrument of justice she'd always dreamed it would be. Years later, after recovery and education, Esther Penn graduated from nursing school, then law school. The young woman who dreamed of healing had been forged in darkness into something more. A prosecutor who specialized in crimes against the vulnerable. A voice for the voiceless. A living testament to a spirit that could not be broken. Her story was a tragedy, but it was also proof of something indomitable in the human soul. The power of memory, the strength of love and the absolute refusal to be erased.